The sinking sensation of a 737 captain confronted by the tragic crash of Jeju Air Flight 2216 is that the pilots made a few blunders that transformed a simple emergency into a mass casualty event. With the investigation still underway, pointing the finger at the flight crew isn't taken lightly. There's no question that any potential errors occurred in the haze of a chaotic environment not the crew's own making. There's also no question that the concrete wall a couple hundred meters off the end of runway 19 resulted in devastating consequences. It's unlikely that the pilots were aware or saw the wall until it was far too late for them to do anything about it. There's going to be plenty of blame to distribute when it comes time to assign the ultimate responsibility for the 179 deaths. But that's not what accident investigations are good for. The main purpose is not to moralize. We leave that to the media. Accident investigations in aviation are devices to prevent future accidents. The saying is, the rules are written in blood. The blood of those who have perished over time in far too many aviation crashes. So we end up where we started, with a question of why the aircraft was going so fast when it touched down and why the gear wasn't extended. Sounds from the video on the ground indicated that at least one engine was running during the slide down the runway. The number 2 engine is a likely culprit, as its thrust reverser can be seen in the extended position. The landing gear requires pressure from hydraulic system A in order to extend the gear normally via the gear handle located in front of the pilots on the flight deck. If the number 1 or left engine was shut down, and video evidence of the touchdown lends credibility to this idea as a haze of hot exhaust can be seen trailing the number 2 engine but not the number 1, then the engine-driven pump that allows for normal gear extension would not have been functional. However, a backup electrical pump, which is always active, would have provided hydraulic pressure for normal gear extension. Both the engine-driven pump and the electrical pump are required to be functional for flight. This makes it highly likely that normal gear extension was available to the flight crew. There were 2 approaches to the airport. The first was towards the active runway, referred to as runway 1 due to its approximate 010-degree orientation. The second, fateful approach was in the opposite direction to runway 19. ADS-B data for the first approach indicates that the crew was in the landing configuration as the aircraft descended to below 500 feet prior to an unexplained go-around. The likely culprit for the go-around was a bird strike that the crew reported to air traffic controllers. At such a low altitude, as long as the aircraft was still controllable, continuation to a landing would have been an acceptable response. That said, a go-around is always an acceptable option. Far too many runway overruns have resulted due to the crews failing to abandon an unstable approach and go around. Without the gift of hindsight, there is no blame for the decision of the crew to discontinue the approach. A go-around in a 737 goes like this. The pilot will state, go-around, TOGA, flaps 15. TOGA is an acronym that stands for takeoff go-around. This refers to an advanced thrust setting that allows the aircraft to climb away from the ground. Normal flaps configuration in the 737 is either 30 or 40 degrees at the pilot's discretion. The call for flaps 15 reduces drag while also ensuring that the wings contribute to produce enough lift at the slow approach speed. After the pilot flying establishes the aircraft in a climb, the pilot monitoring will say positive rate. The response, gear up. After this, the aircraft climbs away and becomes reconfigured as necessary. Flaps may be retracted entirely or not, depending on the flight crew's next intentions. Whatever the case, the gear had clearly been retracted by the flight crew following the first approach, which indicates normal hydraulic system A operation at this point. The next bit is going to remain unclear until more information is released by investigators. Typically, once the flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorders are processed, a preliminary report will be published. But there are a few things that seem obvious at this point. The pilots declared an emergency. We can see in surveillance video either the initial bird strike to the number 2 engine, or, perhaps more likely, a compressor stall to that engine indicative of damage to the engine. There is a heightened likelihood of smoke and fumes in the cabin of the aircraft in this scenario. The number 2 engine provides air to the cabin of the aircraft, while the number 1 engine provides air to the flight deck. At some point, the captain decided it was necessary to immediately land, and so the aircraft maneuvered for the opposite runway, which almost certainly would have been the quickest way to get on the ground. Weather data will be released with the preliminary report, but active runways generally are the runways best aligned with the prevailing winds. This reduces ground speed and thus kinetic energy of an aircraft as it touches down, simultaneously reducing the amount of runway required to stop within. A quick physics lesson here. Kinetic energy is an exponential formula. If an aircraft doubles its speed, its kinetic energy quadruples. A handful of extra knots of ground speed results in a significant increase in ground roll to decelerate. The video from the skidding touchdown does not definitively establish the condition of the flaps, but they do not appear to be in the normal 30 or 40 degree setting, which would have resulted in higher speed during the approach and landing, exacerbating the high energy state. Either the crew forgot to extend the flaps for the emergency landing, or, and this is very likely, they were configured for a single engine landing, which utilizes flaps 15 to reduce drag on the thrust limited aircraft. Given the apparent operation of at least one engine during landing, it seems likely that normal gear extension was available to the crew. The fact that the gear was not extended would indicate that the crew forgot it, perhaps because they had already extended it for their previous landing attempt. In the chaotic environment, they simply did not identify that it had been retracted during the go-around. A rather pronounced gear horn sounds with the thrust levers at or below normal approach settings when close to the ground, as long as a radar altimeter system is functional, which it normally is, but it is a system that can be deferred for a set number of days if it becomes inoperative. Odds are, on this flight, it was working, meaning that the horn would have likely sounded as the aircraft descended through 800 feet. This horn is very rarely heard by flight crews, so possibly the pilots were confused by its meaning, or so wrapped up in an emerging crisis, they simply didn't realize it was alerting. I've trained a number of pilots in the simulator, and it is remarkable how many times they will remain unaware of obvious sounds indicating an abnormal condition when they are task saturated. It seems increasingly likely that the failure to extend the gear was an error on the part of the flight crew. The touchdown itself was slightly long, but with normal wheels and braking, they would have been able to stop on the runway. And the slightly long landing itself was likely because the aircraft didn't have the extra 3 feet of extended gear to settle on. The question as to why the pilots were in such a hurry to land will come with the release of flight data and cockpit voice recorders. A good bet is some combination of a significant reduction in engine thrust and potential smoke in the cabin. Video of the aircraft and what looks like its initial approach to runway 1 captures tiny glints along the exhaust of both engines. Not long after this, a large flame shoots out of the number 2 engine. It is altogether possible that the aircraft ingested birds into both engines. If so, a combination of in-flight shutdown or reduced thrust due to internal engine damage could have reduced the ability of the aircraft to climb to a safe altitude during the ensuing go-around. In this case, the mistake would have been the decision to discontinue the approach, but again, this is a hard area to blame the pilots. We've spent years and years and years trying to get them to go around more often. A dozen accidents at least in the past decade are a result of the failure to do so. It should be noted that if the aircraft made a shallow second approach to the runway, the thrust levers could well have been above the setting where the gear warning horn would alert. They may not have heard the horn until they were reducing power in the flare, which would have been too late to do anything about it. Whatever the case, the pilots are bound to take some lumps in the aftermath. The decision to go around may well be called into question, and it may well be valid, but it was a decision that had to be made in a matter of seconds, and decisions under such circumstances are always prone to error. The bigger issue was a failure to extend the landing gear. As I pointed out, this wasn't necessarily a result of gross incompetence, but it still rests on the shoulders of the pilots. There also remains a possibility that the situation was not nearly as dire as the pilots made it. Their urgency inflamed by emotions and not sound technique. In the grand scheme of things, it won't bring those 179 passengers back, but I hope that's not the case. Being a pilot can sometimes be an unfair job, perfection called for in confusing situations. Obviously, for whatever reason, that did not happen here. Godspeed, stay safe.